If your child is obese, should you be charged with criminal neglect? Well, that's exactly what's happening to a South Carolina mother whose 14-year-old son weighs 555 pounds. But is childhood obesity really the same as child abuse? Well, young Dickerson, a partner at Small and Plevy, is here now to talk about the legal matters in this controversial case and the repercussions of it all for all of us. Kyung, thank you very much for joining us. Good to see you.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
What do you make of this? Is this the first of its kind in the United States?
No, there are other states that have intervened in this fashion. Their courts have, but I find it very troubling. I find it very troubling that the courts would intervene in this fashion because the courts are such a blunt instrument to deal with a problem that has so many different factors. There's genetics, there's environment, there's the resources of the family, there's also the child itself. The child in the South Carolina case, 14-year-old boy.
Yes, and there's also the question of what constitutes obesity. I mean, at what point does the court need to intervene when you weigh 200 pounds, 250 pounds, you know, whatever?
And the problem is also that the specialists are telling us that early childhood eating behavior, your sort of eating habits dictate what you're going to be like as an adult, what you're going to be like as a teenager. So do we intervene very early on before there's even obesity, or do we wait until they're morbidly obese? I find that very troubling, and also in part because there were other people giving this child food. It's my understanding that the child was getting food from other sources besides his mother. This is a 14-year-old. So do we now hold those people also equally liable for abusing this child? What if the child goes out and gets drugs? 14-year-old gets drugs on the street. Do we now hold the mother liable because someone else has given this child drugs?
So what do you think the likely outcome of this case is?
I don't know. I find it difficult to comment, in part because we don't know all the evidence that's going to be played in front of the court, and we also don't know whether the child has a thyroid problem or has some medical issue that the mother didn't have necessarily the time or the resources to address. Perhaps this is a case where the child needs medical intervention. But I'm disturbed that they're using an abuse charge against this mother in this fashion, especially because we have the flip side of the case. We have a number of teenagers who are anorexic, who have eating disorders on the other end. At what point do we intervene in those cases?
Interesting point. The parents are ultimately, you could make a case, responsible for feeding that child. But we're seeing as a society, as a culture, sort of a shift in this direction, maybe not to this extent, not with the blunt instruments as you termed it earlier, but in smaller ways. We saw a suit last week. The Center for Science and the Public Interest filed a lawsuit against Denny's for excess salt content in some of their foods. We've seen that professor with John Bonzoff, I think, at George Washington University, who has filed lawsuit against various restaurants and entities for fat content in food and things of that sort. So where are we heading?
I'm not certain, but we also did have that lawsuit against McDonald's with the two children who were obese by their parents, and that got thrown out by the court. I don't know where we're headed, but wherever we're headed, we have programs in place. For example, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, we have statutory programs so that parents can ask for the court's intervention when they need services or supervision for their children, when they can't control their children.
You mentioned that the courts are a blunt instrument for cases like this. What makes them a blunt instrument? Why are they a blunt instrument?
Because their jurisdiction is dictated by statute, and what they can do, what's available to them in terms of a remedy, is also limited. We also have, in other cases, where parents, to avoid this neglect charge, are thinking about gastric bypass for their children. In those cases, are the parents being abusive to their children by making the children undergo this process? Do the children have informed consent when the parents put them through this process? It looks like we're headed towards a big mess.
You could nevertheless virtually guarantee that a 14-year-old who weighs 555 pounds is headed down the road for serious medical problems. The least of which is probably going to be diabetes or something like that. Diabetes is an epidemic in this country. We're also heading towards some form of nationalized health care, at which point cost limitations are going to have to be imposed. So if it's not the courts, who is going to impose these kinds of limitations on what we can and cannot do, and how we're going to pay for the treatment of them?
Well, I'm hoping that with the national health care, we have preventative care as part of that. And I think this is a legislative solution. If the legislators want to intervene, if they want to establish programs, if they want to fund schools and allow the schools to intervene, if they want to have social programs in place so that people who don't necessarily have the education or the access to, for example, a nutritionist for their children could go and get help. That might be a much better solution to address all the numerous factors that go into obesity, as opposed to pulling a child and putting him in foster care.
We had a case in Minnesota recently where the blunt instrument of the court did in fact intervene in a health care case, a teenager who had some form of cancer.
Yes.
And his parents were refusing because he didn't want to take it, chemotherapy, and the courts made him take it. The child is, to the best of my knowledge right now, in recovery. So that blunt instrument worked in that case.
It did, but there was a factor of religion in that case. The family believed religiously that they couldn't do this. We give great deference to the right of parents to raise their children. There is no right parenting skill, as it were, just like there's no one parenting skill that works for every child out there. And perhaps the better course would be to give the parents the support and structure that they need, as opposed to putting them in an adversarial position with the court system or with social services who could help them.
It's going to be very interesting to see where all of this goes, because we're not getting any thinner as a society. So we're going to see these kinds of things cropping up more and more. Kyung Dickerson, a partner with Smolin Plevy, thank you very much for your insight. Appreciate it very much. Thanks for coming.